David made me feel old twice in his little announcements there. First, he didn't know the song Holy of Holies there that I first was introduced to in the late 80s by the band Petra, who was a rock band who could also praise Jesus at the same time. And I mean like serious rock band with lots of hair. And that was different for me, having grown up in a church that didn't do that. So, and then he talked about, being candidate and the questions, and I thought, I really don't have a lot of good stories because he was very small and I was away in college at that time, so I do know his parents, so if you want connections that way to ask questions, I could do that, but man, felt old when that happened. So this morning, as we look at Hebrews 9, it's easy to look at a passage like this and feel like it's just odd. What do we do with a passage like this? But I was reminded of King David in Psalm 122:1, who says, I rejoice with those who said to me, let us go into the house of the Lord. And it's interesting because the temple hadn't been built yet, but the tabernacle was still sort of there at that time, the tabernacle we read about. And there's something about gathering for worship that is crucial to our spiritual well-being. And I think that the COVID shutdowns and everything we've had to deal with for almost a year now have really shown us that even the most introverted of us needs that kind of connection. We need that. We're starting to hear even on the news about kids and needing to be back in school for their mental well-being right now, as much as for their parents' sanity. We need to worship together. And worship is not just a Christian thing. It's deeper than that. It's deeper than whether we're overtly religious or we're not religious at all. It's really a fundamental thing to being human. It doesn't matter what our background is, what our culture, our ethnicity. If we look around, we're going to find worship. Even those people who don't think of themselves as religious at all worship something. One of the examples that always hits me is when I look at pop culture, pop music in particular, we find singers, whether in the last couple of years or 20 years ago or 40 years ago, who like to take religious imagery and turn it on its head. And we usually make it about things like sex, something that we intentionally turn the sacred into something profane. But the very fact that these pop singers do this, that they want to free themselves from the religious imagery, shows us something important. It shows us that we can't get away from those religious elements, from that worship element. There's something there, as Bob Dylan famously sang, you're going to have to serve somebody. It may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're going to have to serve somebody. The North African Christian father, Bishop Augustine, put it this way: our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. We need to worship. That connection with the divine, with God, that's at the heart of worship. But the problem is we're all conflicted, right? We need the connection, but we rebel against it. We live with the push and pull of what we were created for in our own brokenness. And as Christians, we're just as capable of twisting worship as people who are not believers. In the late 1990s, there was a guy named Matt. He went to church at a church in Watford, England. And at one point, the pastor of the church decided, okay, we're pulling all of the sound system. We're pulling the band. Because worship had become more about performance, all the stuff, than anything else. And he asked the church, when you come through the doors on Sunday, what are you bringing as your offering to God? And Matt thought about it. Not long after, he sat down in his bedroom and he started writing out some ideas and thoughts. And he had conversations with that pastor who gave him some suggestions, and this is what those words ended up being. When the music fades, all is stripped away, and I simply come, longing just to bring something that's of worth that will bless your heart. I'll bring you more than a song, for a song in itself is not what you have required. You search much deeper within. Through the way things appear, you're looking into my heart. I'm coming back to the heart of worship, and it's all about you. It's all about you, Jesus. I'm sorry, Lord, for the thing I've made it, when it's all about you. It's all about you, Jesus. Of course, that scribbling in his bedroom became the lyrics to the song, The Heart of Worship, and Matt is Matt Redman. And that song has been performed by countless artists in all around the world in lots of different languages. And the reason why is because deep down it rings true to the lives that we live. And as we continue our series in Hebrews, and we come to chapter 9, and for the past few weeks we have looked at Jesus as high priest and the role that he has. And today we're going to look at the place the priest serves, the tabernacle. And as we just heard, there's all kinds of details going on here. Things that might feel completely foreign to us, but in the end, this is all about worship. How do we worship God? And chances are you know someone from a different religion who worships differently than you. And I believe that this passage can help us to understand, to have compassion upon those people because they don't have Jesus. And it can also help us make sure that we are getting worship right, not twisting it. Because just like Matt Redman, we can twist worship. Even when we think we're coming from a sincere place, we can get off track. Because at the end of the day, worship is about reverence. It's about adoring God, giving him his due. It's a key purpose of the church. The church is here to disciple others, to reach out to people who don't know Jesus, to serve, to get together to fellowship. All of those things we're here to do. But worship comes first. And this passage today that we're looking at, we see that as important as the content of our faith is, and it's really important, the focus today is not so much about what we know, it's about this heart of worship, of connection with God. And the author sets up a contrast. Worship in the Old Covenant and worship in the New Covenant. We might call it human worship versus heavenly worship. And we begin in verses 1 to 10 with human worship. And there's, I think, twin dangers in a passage like this one in Hebrews 9. And we can first get bogged down in the details of all the stuff, the curtains and the places and the elements and things, and check out this cool thing that I just figured out, and we go on to tangents and we miss the point. And verse 5 told us, hey, we can't get into all the details right now. And the flip side is we get the idea that none of this applies to us, right? That's foreign, weird stuff that I don't have to worry about. But really, it does. It gets at common human needs and problems and shortcomings. Because everyone worships something. We worship in different ways, and it looks different and maybe foreign, but there's a slide that I'm going to show of worship practices around the world. And you see different things that people do. And some of those look familiar. And some of them might be foreign. Some of them are really familiar, if you're paying attention. Some are comforting and some are scary. And look, religions are not all the same, no matter what anyone tells you. They have different beliefs, different goals, different ways of looking at the world. And the worship that we see around the world can look and is very different. And we need to take those differences seriously. but there are some commonalities. At its most basic level, what is human worship all about? In this passage, we hear, if you look at the words and the kind of language that's used, holy, set apart, consecrated, glory, ministry, offered, gifts, sacrifices, redemption. Worship, humanly speaking, is about what can I do to connect with God. In the ancient world, the gods. In our world, with God. Twice, once in verse 9 and once in verse 14, we see something specific about the why of all these things. Verse 9 says, "This is an illustration for the present time," indicating that the gifts and sacrifices being offered were not able to clear the conscience of the worshiper. Verse 14, "How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death?" One of the key things that human worship is about is clearing our consciences. It's a why. We worship, at least in part, as humans, because as much as we don't want it to be true, we know that we all sin. We might want to justify ourselves, to believe that what we do is really not so bad. Oh, that can't be sin because I want it. Because it makes me feel good. Why does God care about what I watch or who I sleep with or how I treat people who aren't like me? We work really hard to justify ourselves, but we know that we're covering. We know that our consciences tell us, oh, that's not right. We know because there are sins that even if we want to justify ourselves, we know those people sin, that we won't ever say, that's not a sin. We all know that there is sin, that we compromise on our own ideals, that we can't live up to our own standards. And we worship. We do the religious things, praying or confessing or going to church or whatever our tradition is in order to clear our conscience. But our author, the author of Hebrews, tells us human practice can't get us there. It's not enough. Even the system that God set up, the stuff of the old covenant, human worship can't clear our consciences. And why does that clean conscience matter? Some have said, oh, it's just guilt and we shouldn't have it. Irish rocker Hozier, in his song, "Take Me to Church," specifically takes Christian, Catholic symbols on purpose and turns them on his head because he says that sin is a man-made idea and it's bad. But we know better. Why? Because we need a connection to God. Pagans, ancient or modern, get a lot wrong. They worship creation, not the Creator, Paul tells us in Romans 1. They exchange what should be worshipped, God, for mere images of created things. But they can't get away from the need for connection to the divine, with the God who created us in His image. Even if they don't believe in Him, they can't get away from worship, because as bad as humans are, as fallen as we are, we can never completely erase what He's done. It's just not possible. In the case of the Old Covenant, God set up this covenant, this worship practice, as a means for us to restore that connection. And as we've seen over and over in Hebrews, it wasn't complete. It wasn't enough. It did not and could not ultimately solve the problem. It was intended to be a temporary solution. One commentator I read talked about making a trip to Boston at one point. And when he was there was a huge construction project to essentially redo all of the major roadways in Boston. And so during that time, there were alternate routes that everyone had to take. They had to figure out. And it lasted for years, maybe decades, I'm not sure. But you had to get other ways until the project was done. And he said that the old covenant is sort of like those alternate routes until the new covenant is done. And verses 1 to 10 show us that the old covenant worship was intended to connect people to God. But verse 8 tells us that the system wasn't complete, that it wasn't finished. It can't be complete until the final way is open, and that's Jesus. You see, the old covenant has a place, it has a purpose, and it forges a connection with God. And as Christians, it's part of our story. And there are things that we can learn from it. And those things are important for us to see. Our passage identifies 3 different ways of how we worship as human beings. Elements that really every religion has. You see, there's systems, and there's places, and there's practices. Systems, verse 1 tells us that the Old Covenant had regulations, right? There were 613 of them. They were complicated. The law, the content of belief, the ways that we worship. And that's part of worship. How we know God and how we connect with Him. But he reveals stuff about Himself in the law, and things like His transcendence and His holiness, His righteousness and His regard for truth and justice. And it also includes what we should do about it. But our passage shows that this content, this believe stuff, is not the sum total of what worship is about. Because verses 1 and 2 also talk about places. And we'll see a slide with buildings, different ways of this how we worship. We worship in a church building. It's a pretty standard box. It's utilitarian, right? It does what we need it to do. It's where we gather. It orients people, you, to this place up front. And churches are different. We look at things in different ways, and you see different churches in different ways places that people worship. Small and large, inside and out. Things that, 2 of those are, one you're sitting in and the other is just down the road. The places that we set aside for worship matter. They can be familiar or strange, but they have very specific meaning and elements. And we might not understand why they are designed the way they are, but for instance, medieval churches were designed in the shape of a cross on purpose. Because you see, most people couldn't read. And so the theology was built into the architecture. And as we learned last week in chapter 8 of Hebrews in verse 5, the temple, the tabernacle, was created with very specific instructions. And we'll see the next slide has what the tabernacle looked like. This is a recreation of the tabernacle that we just read about. It's at a park in Israel. And you see the outer curtain around it, and there is a main altar and a basin for washing. And the tabernacle was a tent at the very center of the camp of the people of Israel during the Exodus. That's where it gets set up. And God is at the center, and all of the tribes are arranged around it in very specific order. Each a space set aside and dedicated to God. And later the temple would function in the same way. Because sacred spaces are important. And sometimes we think they're not, that it doesn't matter. And we've heard this over and over, right, during the COVID. You can go pray on your own at your house. And it's true, but it's a very reduced understanding of worship. And sometimes it's our own fault because Protestants, especially, often we look at John chapter 4. Jesus meets the Samaritan woman. And she tries to distract him by arguing about where worship should happen. Mount Gerizim, where the Samaritans did, or Jerusalem, where the Jews worshiped. And what does Jesus say? In verse 21, the time of John 4, the time is coming when worship won't occur in either place. And he goes on in verses 23 and 24 to say that true worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth. It's the words of Jesus. It's got to be true. And so we take it to mean that place doesn't matter. But that's not exactly what he's saying. What he's saying is that what goes on inside matters more. What is he doing? He's pointing to the new covenant, where, as we saw last week, the law will be written in our hearts and minds. And he was probably giving her a taste of the fact that within about 30 years, the temple in Jerusalem is going to be gone. The Romans are going to destroy it. It's not going to be possible to worship in those places, so what do you do? He never says that place isn't important. Remember, when Jesus says he built his church, he's not saying just me and Jesus. He's saying us as a group of individuals. And as we learned last week, this tabernacle is a copy of God's throne room. And the next slide is going to show you an artist's illustration of what's going on in this passage. This is from the Illustrated Study Bible from Tyndale, and it's an artist's rendering of what goes on. What is going on in verses 1 to 10? And so you have the outer courtyard, which we've said, and there's two places in the tabernacle. And the first space, the holy place, is where this is verses 2 and 3. It's the first room, and it contains the lampstand and a table with consecrated bread, which was refreshed basically every week. And the second room, the Holy of Holies, or the most holy place, was behind that curtain that it's sort of semi-transparent. And it could only be entered once a year on the Day of Atonement, and only by the high priest, and only with blood. And it contains the Ark of the Covenant, and it seems that that incense altar, which is shown as being right in front of that, either was moved into the Holy of Holies, or the curtain was moved around it when this happened. And the ark contained specific items: jar of manna, Aaron's rod that budded, the stone tablets from Moses. And these were specific items that showed God's grace to the people. It was the mercy seat, we're told. And the cover was called the atonement cover. And the cherubim are on it. And other places throughout the Old Testament identified the cherubim with God's throne. This place, the Ark of the Covenant, is where God reigns on earth. It's where heaven and earth intersect. This is God's earthly throne room. And all of this stuff in verses 1 to 10, this tabernacle as a whole is the place where worship was centered, where the practices of worship took place, where the priests ministered, we're told in verse 6, where sacrifices and offerings on behalf of the people were given. And there's a lot of them, and they're complicated. A few of us were talking about that before the service. They're complicated. There's rituals and regulations, ways for worship to happen. And the law set up specific sacrifices and specific offerings and a calendar of events and observances, things like Sabbath and Passover and New Moon and Jubilee and unleavened bread and harvest and booths and Day of Atonement and more. And later, there were more that were added. At the time of Esther, Purim was added. And then, in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's this Greek guy, Antiochus Epiphanes, who desecrates the temple, sacrifices a pig to Zeus in the temple. Pig, unclean, Zeus, foreign god. And after that, there's a rededication ceremony, and we get Hanukkah from that rededication ceremony. And you know what? Jesus celebrated Hanukkah. John 10. That's when he does that. So we've got all of those things. And we have similar kinds of things. If you grew up in a more liturgical church, you're familiar with church calendars and with a more formalized worship service with daily readings and offices. But then there's us, and we're not a highly liturgical church, but we have worship practices, things, ways that we do. We get together. We have people up here leading worship and singing songs. We do prayers. We have sermons like I'm doing right now. We celebrate communion, and we talked about a baptism class coming up for baptism. All of that's part of worship, and we celebrate specific days like Easter and Christmas, and we throw in other more secular days like Mother's Day and Memorial Day, and we brought those into the way we do church. But the point is that worship includes systems and places and practices. But what does worship do? All of this stuff, all of the trappings, all of the things in verses 1 to 10, what does it do? What's the point? It's supposed to clear our consciences. It's supposed to connect us to God, but can it? What does verse 9 tell us? This is an illustration for the present time, indicating that the gifts and sacrifices being offered were not able. They can't do it. Verse 10 tells us that they are external regulations and that they're only meant to last to the new covenant. So human worship actually does two things. First, it creates a barrier to God. Those illustrations showed you a couple of barriers. 3, actually. You see, there's a curtain around the tabernacle that separates the people from the tabernacle. Normal people could see the tabernacle because it's in the center. God is at the center. We can see that the tabernacle is there, but we can't go there. Only the priest can. There's a barrier between them and God, and that can be pretty disheartening. But at the same time, it wasn't disheartening to them. Because if you'll remember from Exodus, from the Exodus, Moses goes up to Mount Sinai to get the 10 Commandments in Exodus 19. When he comes down, people are terrified and say, Moses, here's the deal. You talk to God. We don't want to talk directly to God because if we do, he'll kill us. And later, in Exodus 33, God says he's not going to travel with the people of Israel because they're stubborn and rebellious. And if he travels with them, he's going to destroy them. They go into a period of mourning and he relents. You see, the barrier between us and God is both bad because our connection with God is severed, and it's good because without it, we get destroyed. And that's what the Old Covenant says. And there's more barriers because there's the barrier even for the priests. They can only go into the holy place on specific times and places. Only the high priest can go into the most holy priest. And this is the best that a human system can do, a system set up by God. Other human systems, other religions worship in ways that put up even more barriers to God because they don't understand God. They get God wrong. They obscure who God is and what he wants. They obscure the way to have a truly cleared conscience and connect us with God. And it doesn't matter if they're formal religions or if they don't look like religions at all. They are the things that we make religions out of, the things that we worship and we don't recognize we do it. Money and power and sex and self-fulfillment and my identity and a host of other things. Some of those things are good things and some of those things are destructive things, but none of them can do ultimately what worship is for. They can't connect us to God. They can't point us to the true fulfillment of worship in Jesus. And that was the point of the Old Covenant. Verses 8 and 9 tell us that the Holy Spirit was using the Old Covenant worship to precisely show us that we needed connection with God through Jesus. We read in verses 8 and 9 that the Old Covenant shows us that the way to the Holy of Holies, take me into the Holy of Holies, that way is closed until Jesus comes. Jesus, the great high priest, who tears the veil, who enters in. And true worship should point us, true human worship should ultimately point us to Jesus. It doesn't matter whether we participate in formal or informal worship, whether we're on our own or gathered in large or small groups. Worship should always point us to Jesus. And in verses 11 to 14, we see that is the heart of true worship, of heavenly worship. When Jesus comes, he brings the new covenant. And the new covenant changes everything. Verse 10 calls him high priest and Messiah. And he brings the blessings of the new covenant. The blessings we saw last week in chapter 8, verses 6 and following. They are here and now. And we're told that Jesus enters into the true Holy of Holies, God's throne room, the place of atonement, the eternal temple. Not a tent or even a human-made temple. Not created by human hands. This is God's place not just on earth, but in the entire universe. Verse 14 tells us that Jesus accomplishes what human worship can't accomplish, what it could not accomplish. He actually cleanses our consciences, truly and for all time, from the acts that we do that lead to death. Everyone worships something. You know why? Because we all know death is coming and we need something to overcome that disconnect. And Jesus cleanses us, we're told, from that cause of death. And when we're cleaned this way, Jesus connects us to God. Because he's always in the Holy of Holies. He's always interceding on our behalf. Every day is the Day of Atonement because of what he has done and if we are his. The question for us is, are we willing to give up our human striving? Are we willing to give up our human worship and instead take on a heavenly worship? Are we willing to give up being right but never right enough? And instead acknowledge that we are often not right and we have to follow the great high priest who solves our deepest human problem? It's not easy to give up that illusion of control, that illusion of righteousness, because human worship can't do the job. It's symbols, our passage tells us, until the appointed time, and that time is now because Jesus eliminates the barriers to God. How does Jesus do this? Leviticus 17:11 says that the high priest had to bring blood into the Holy of Holies because life is in the blood. Because separation from God means separation from life itself, because God is life. But Hebrews 9:12 tells us that Jesus didn't have to bring the blood of bulls or goats because his blood was enough. His blood is enough. His blood is holy because he is God as well as human. He is true life, and therefore the payment that he makes is enough. Jesus offers himself, something no one else can do, something indescribable, and which sanctifies us inside and out. The old covenant could wash us on the outside, but only on the outside. It made people outwardly clean. And that's no small thing, because on our own we can't even do that. But the old covenant could only give us a temporary fix. The new covenant, the covenant of Jesus' blood, that illustration earlier of worship, of communion at the beginning, the new covenant. The blood of Christ does what we can never do on our own. Human worship gives us a taste of connection with God. Heavenly worship seals the deal. Human worship reminds us that there is a barrier. It makes us feel clean, feel spiritual on the outside and for a moment. But it can never clean us on the inside. Only Jesus can do that. And because of this, because of what Jesus has done on our behalf, because of his once-for-all sacrifice, he enables us to serve the living God. You see, priests could serve in the temple only after they were ritually cleansed. That's why that big basin of water was there. And when Jesus cleanses us, our passage shows us that two things change in our lives. First, we become temples of the Holy Spirit. God dwelled in the Holy of Holies, in the tabernacle. And when the new covenant comes, we are told that God will write his laws on our heart and our minds, that he will be our God and we will be his people. That's chapter 8, verses 10 and 11. And this happens because God forgives us, that he forgives our sins. The connection is restored. And the Holy Spirit, the means of Christ's offering on our behalf, we read in verse 14, lives in us. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 3:16 that we become the temples of God, that the Holy Spirit lives in us. That's what it means for the new covenant to be effective. God dwells within us. We become the place, the sacred space that God uses to show himself to the world. We become the place where the practices of worship happen. And that allows us to fulfill our true calling. The very last phrase of verse 14. What does it say? So that we may serve the living God. Jesus' work on our behalf allows us to serve the living God. So it seems that Bob Dylan was on to something. The thing is, it's not that we have to serve somebody. We get to serve God. We get to be connected to the very center of not just the camp, but of everything that is. We are going to mess up. And we're going to get distracted. And we're going to make it about us instead of about God, striving to solve a problem that only God can do. But heavenly worship means that we don't have to solve the problem, that Jesus already has. And he offers it to anyone who's willing to accept it. We get the connection that we could never establish on our own. And we get to participate in the kind of worship that is real and eternal. We get Jesus, and we get to show him to the whole world. And that is the true heart of worship. And the last verse of Matt Redman's song says, King of endless worth, no one could express how much you deserve. Though I'm weak and poor, all I have is yours. Every single breath. I'm coming back to the heart of worship, and it's all about you. It's all about you, Jesus.